One assumption says that Ottoman Empire defeat in 1453 would have made Islam spread globally by -30%. That's about 600 million less of Islamists as of today's numbers. While Islam being considered a religion of polar opposites, we try to approach this with new perspective upon the topic. This imaginary story goes through alternative reality events, and what implications would that have had in today's world? May 29th, 1453. The walls of Constantinople, built by Emperor Theodosius II 1,000 years earlier, stand battered but unbroken. For 53 days, Sultan Mehmed II's Ottoman army of 80,000 men has besieged the ancient city. Massive cannons, including the legendary basilica that fires 600-pound stone balls, have pounded the fortifications relentlessly. Inside, Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos commands a desperate defense with only 7,000 men, outnumbered more than 10 to 1. The Byzantine Empire, once spanning 3 continents, has been reduced to a single city. This is the final stand of Rome itself, 2,206 years after its founding. In our timeline, the walls fell, the Ottomans stormed through, and Constantinople became Istanbul. The conquest marked the end of the Middle Ages, the rise of the Ottoman Empire as a global superpower, and the spread of Islam across 3 continents. For the next 500 years, the Ottoman Empire would shape world history, controlling trade routes, spreading Islamic culture, and challenging European powers at every turn. But what if Mehmed II failed? What if Constantine's defense held? Today we see that Ottoman expansion stopped at Constantinople's walls, and the empire that should have dominated the early modern world instead collapsed into fragmentation. The implications would reshape everything: European development, Islamic history, global trade, even the trajectory of colonialism and industrialization. We journey through an alternative timeline where the greatest siege in medieval history ended in defeat for the attackers, and the Ottoman Empire fractured instead of flourished. One where the Islamic world took a radically different path that would echo into our present day. Act 1. Siege that should have failed. May 29th, 1453, 1:30 a.m. The final Ottoman assault begins. In our timeline, this attack succeeded. Ottoman forces broke through at the Kerkaporta Gate, allegedly left unlocked by accident. Janissaries, the elite Ottoman infantry, poured through. By dawn, the city had fallen. Emperor Constantine died fighting in the streets, and the Byzantine Empire ceased to exist. But examining the historical record reveals something extraordinary. The siege should have failed. The Ottoman losses were staggering. Estimates suggest 50,000 casualties over 53 days, more than 60% of the attacking force. Mehmed's commanders were urging retreat. His ammunition was running low. Disease was spreading through the Ottoman camp. The legendary cannon Basilica had exploded during the siege, killing its inventor, Urban, and destroying morale. Most critically, Venetian and Genoese relief fleets were en route. If Constantinople held for just 2 more weeks, the Ottomans would have been trapped between the city's walls and European reinforcements. The conquest succeeded by the narrowest of margins, a single unlocked gate, a moment of confusion, a stroke of luck in the final hours. In our alternative timeline, that luck failed. Locked gate. In the pre-dawn darkness of May 29, 1453,
Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese commander leading Constantinople's defense, made a different choice. In our timeline, Giustiniani was seriously wounded during the final assault and withdrawn from the walls. His absence broke Byzantine morale at the critical moment. The Kirkaporta Gate, located in a section he was defending, was left unsecured during the confusion. In the alternative timeline, Giustiniani's wound was less severe, a glancing blow rather than a direct hit. He remained at his post. The gate stayed locked and guarded. When Ottoman forces reached the walls in that final assault, they found every entrance defended. The Janissaries, exhausted from 7 weeks of siege and facing determined resistance, faltered. As dawn broke and the attack clearly failed, Mehmed II faced the most difficult decision of his life. He ordered retreat. The Ottoman army, having lost nearly 50,000 men, withdrew from Constantinople on June 2, 1453. The Byzantine Empire, against all odds, survived. But the consequences of this survival would prove far more complex than simple continuation of the status quo.
The Sultan's crisis. Mehmed II returned to Edirne, the Ottoman capital, in disgrace. The 21-year-old Sultan had staked everything on Constantinople's conquest. He had commissioned the world's largest cannons, assembled the largest siege force in centuries, and promised his soldiers the wealth of Rome's successor city. His failure was not just military, it was existential. Within months, the Ottoman Empire faced its greatest crisis since its founding. Regional governors, seeing Mehmed's weakness, declared independence. In Anatolia, the Karamanids, Turkish rivals who had opposed Ottoman expansion, rebelled and seized territories. In the Balkans, Serbian and Hungarian forces launched offensives to reclaim lands lost to previous Ottoman conquests. The Janissaries, unpaid and demoralized, mutinied in Edirne. By early 1454, the Ottoman Empire was collapsing. In our timeline, the conquest of Constantinople consolidated Mehmed's power, filled the treasury with plunder, and established the Ottomans as the dominant power in the Eastern Mediterranean. The empire expanded for another 150 years, eventually controlling territory from Algeria to Iraq, from Hungary to Yemen. In the alternative timeline, the failed siege triggered fragmentation that would reshape the Islamic world for centuries. But what happened next would prove even more consequential than Ottoman decline alone. The survival of Constantinople set off a chain reaction that would transform European civilization, redirect global exploration, and fundamentally alter how Christianity and Islam interacted for the next 500 years. But the evidence forces us to confront an uncomfortable possibility that the fall of Constantinople, for all its tragedy, might have prevented even greater catastrophes in both the Islamic and Christian worlds. Act 2. Observable Signatures. The Byzantine Renaissance. Historical reconstructions from this alternative timeline reveal something extraordinary. Constantinople's survival triggered an immediate intellectual explosion that historians call the Byzantine Renaissance. In our timeline, when Constantinople fell, Greek scholars fled westward, bringing classical manuscripts to Italy. This influx of knowledge helped spark the Italian Renaissance. The printing press, invented by Gutenberg, spread these rediscovered texts rapidly. In the alternative timeline, the scholars didn't flee. They stayed in Constantinople, which remained the intellectual capital of the Eastern Mediterranean. More importantly, they brought the printing press to Constantinople just 2 years after the failed siege. Constantinople was printing books in Greek, Latin, and Arabic. It had established the Imperial Academy, a research institution that united Greek, Islamic, and Western European scholars in the first truly cosmopolitan university since antiquity. The implications were revolutionary.
ancient Greek texts that were lost in our timeline. Perhaps 30% of classical literature survived because they remained in Constantinople's libraries. Mathematical and scientific works from the Islamic Golden Age, which had largely ceased flowing to Europe after 1200, began circulating again. But more profoundly, the continued existence of a Greek Orthodox Empire as a bridge between Christian Europe and the Islamic world created an intellectual conduit that transformed both civilizations. Ottoman Fragmentation. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire was disintegrating. What had been a unified Ottoman state had fractured into 7 competing emirates: the remnant Ottoman state in northwestern Anatolia, the Karamanid Emirate in central Anatolia, the Dulkadir Emirate in the south, and 4 Balkan territories controlled by various beylerbeys who effectively became independent rulers. Each emirate was weak. None could project power beyond its immediate region. The dream of a unified Islamic empire dominating the Mediterranean died with Mehmed II's failed siege. The consequences for Islamic civilization were profound. In our timeline, the Ottoman Empire became the protector of Sunni Islam, eventually controlling the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. The Sultan claimed the title of Caliph, positioning himself as the leader of the global Islamic community. Ottoman military might spread Islam into the Balkans, held back European expansion for centuries, and enabled the religion to spread through trade networks protected by Ottoman power. In the alternative timeline, there was no unifying Islamic superpower. The Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt and Syria remained the dominant Islamic power, but it lacked the military strength and political unity that the Ottomans would have provided. The holy cities remained under Mamluk control, but vulnerable. Islamic civilization, which had been in slow decline since the Mongol invasions of the 13th century, never experienced the Ottoman-led revival. Most significantly, Islam spread into Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Central Asia, much of which occurred under Ottoman influence and protection in our timeline, happened far more slowly and with less geographic reach. Transformation. But here's where it gets strange. The survival of Constantinople fundamentally altered European development in ways that seemed impossible. In our timeline, the fall of Constantinople in 1453 is often cited as marking the end of the Middle Ages. The Ottoman control of Eastern Mediterranean trade routes forced Europeans to seek alternative paths to Asian markets, directly motivating the Age of Exploration. Columbus sailed west seeking India precisely because Ottoman-controlled routes east were closed to Christian merchants. In the alternative timeline, with Constantinople surviving as a Christian-controlled trading hub, European access to Eastern trade remained open. The Age of Exploration still occurred. Economic incentives and technological capability ensured that, but it happened differently and more slowly. Columbus still sailed in 1492, but with less urgency. Portuguese exploration of Africa still proceeded, but competition was less intense. Most significantly, the religious dimension of European expansion changed dramatically. In our timeline, European colonization carried strong Reconquista energy, the drive to spread Christianity as a counter to Islamic expansion, shaped by centuries of conflict with the Ottoman Empire. In the alternative timeline, with no Ottoman threat looming over Europe, colonization was more purely economic rather than ideological. But this represents just one piece of a much larger puzzle hidden in how religious dynamics shifted across 3 continents. Reformation. The most remarkable discovery involves what happened to Christianity in the alternative timeline. In our history, the Protestant Reformation began when Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses. But historians often overlook how the Ottoman threat influenced the Reformation's trajectory. Catholic Europe facing existential danger from Ottoman expansion, was partially unified by external threat. The Reformation fractured that unity at Christianity's moment of maximum danger. In the alternative timeline, with no Ottoman Empire threatening Europe, the Reformation began earlier and progressed differently. Byzantine Christianity, Greek Orthodox tradition, remained vibrant and intellectually dynamic in Constantinople. The Byzantine Renaissance created a third way between Catholic and emerging Protestant thought. When reformist movements emerged in Western Europe, which they inevitably would, given underlying theological and political tensions, they had a living example of non-Catholic Christianity that predated Rome's dominance. Religious reform movements across Europe were looking to Constantinople, not Rome, as their Christian ideal. The split between Eastern and Western Christianity, which had been largely dormant since the Great Schism, became the organizing principle of European religious politics. The Protestant Reformation was less fractious and violent because alternative Christian models already existed. The catastrophic wars of religion that killed millions in our timeline were less severe, though still destructive, in the alternative timeline.
Implications to Islam. Implications for the Islamic world were more troubling. In our timeline, the Ottoman Empire's strength enabled Islamic civilization to remain globally competitive. Ottoman administrative systems, military innovations, and patronage of arts and sciences created a flourishing culture. Istanbul became one of the world's great cities, rivaling any European capital. In the alternative timeline, Islamic civilization experienced what historians call the long stagnation. Without Ottoman unification and strength, the Islamic world fragmented politically. The Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt, while powerful, was economically declining and militarily conservative. The Safavid Empire in Persia, which emerged in both timelines, faced constant war with fragmented Turkish emirates, but never had the Ottoman Empire as a unifying rival. Most critically, the intellectual dynamism that characterized the Islamic Golden Age never recovered in the alternative timeline. In our history, Ottoman patronage supported scholars, scientists, and artists. Ottoman power enabled the preservation and transmission of Islamic knowledge. In the alternative timeline, with multiple weak Islamic states competing for resources, intellectual investment declined. The Islamic world had fallen significantly behind both the Byzantine Empire and Western Europe in science, technology, and economic development. The global Islamic population was approximately 30% smaller than in our timeline, roughly 120 million versus 170 million. The religion's spread through trade and conquest had been substantially curtailed. The question remains, would that continue to our times on smaller scale?
The colonization. The evidence extends beyond Europe and the Islamic world into the realm of global colonization patterns that differ dramatically from our timeline. In our history, European colonization, especially Spanish and Portuguese, carried intense religious motivation. The rivalry with the Ottoman Empire created a civilizational conflict, framing Christianity versus Islam, cross versus crescent. Colonial expansion was justified partly as spreading Christianity to counter Islamic influence. In the alternative timeline, without the Ottoman threat, European colonization was less religiously motivated. Spanish conquistadors still reached the Americas, Portuguese traders still circumnavigated Africa, Dutch and English merchants still established trading companies, but the ideological framework was different, more nakedly economic, less wrapped in religious justification. This had profound consequences for colonized peoples. In our timeline, forced conversion and cultural erasure was seen as religious duties. In the alternative timeline, European colonizers were more willing to accommodate indigenous religions and cultures when economically convenient. The result was less cultural destruction in colonized regions, perhaps 20 to 30% more indigenous cultural survival in the Americas, Africa, and Asia, but also more cynical, purely exploitative economic systems without even the pretense of religious civilization. It's unclear which was worse, the religiously motivated cultural genocide of our timeline or the coldly economic exploitation of the alternative timeline. Both were terrible, just in different ways. Act 3. Diplomatic Revolution. What historians discovered studying this alternative timeline reveals a profound principle. Empires that survive beyond their expected lifespan can fundamentally reshape geopolitical patterns. The Byzantine Empire, given a reprieve, didn't simply continue its slow decline. Instead, it transformed. Constantinople had positioned itself as the essential intermediary between Christian Europe and the Islamic Middle East. Byzantine diplomats brokered trade agreements, mediated religious disputes, and created a framework for coexistence that hadn't existed since the Crusades. This forces us to reconsider fundamental assumptions about Christian-Islamic relations. In our timeline, these relations were defined by Ottoman-European conflict. The Ottomans besieged Vienna twice. Naval battles at Lepanto and elsewhere defined Mediterranean politics. The very concept of Europe was partly formed in opposition to the Ottoman. In the alternative timeline, Christian-Islamic relations were mediated through Byzantine intermediaries. The two civilizations remained in contact and competition, but without the existential warfare that characterized our timeline. Something unprecedented emerged, a concert system of Mediterranean powers, Byzantine, Mamluk, European, and fragmented Turkish states that managed conflicts through diplomacy rather than total war. It wasn't always time of peace. Wars still occurred regularly, but they were limited wars over trade routes and territory, not civilizational conflicts for survival. Technology. This diplomatic framework had technological consequences that seemed counterintuitive. In our timeline, European technological development was significantly spurred by Ottoman military pressure. The need to compete with Ottoman cannons, firearms, and military organization drove European innovation. The Ottoman threat created urgency for European powers to develop better weapons, ships, and fortifications. In the alternative timeline, without that existential pressure, European military innovation proceeded more slowly. Gunpowder weapons developed, but less rapidly. Naval technology advanced, but with less urgency. The technological gap between Europe and the rest of the world, which was massive in our timeline, was much smaller in the alternative timeline. European ships were perhaps 30 to 40 years less advanced. European firearms were less dominant. European military organization, while still effective, hadn't been honed by centuries of Ottoman conflict. This had enormous implications for colonization. European powers could still project force globally, but their advantage over indigenous peoples and Asian kingdoms was less overwhelming. Colonization succeeded, but required more negotiation and accommodation rather than pure conquest. European colonial empires in the alternative timeline controlled approximately 40% less territory than in our history. Indigenous states in Africa, Asia, and the Americas retained more autonomy and power. Printing press. Recent breakthroughs in studying this timeline suggest that the survival of Constantinople as an intellectual hub created an unprecedented phenomenon, a multilingual printing revolution. In our timeline, printing spread primarily through Latin script Europe. Arabic script printing developed slowly. The Ottoman Empire resisted printing in Arabic nearly 3 centuries after Gutenberg, partly due to religious concerns about mechanically reproducing the Quran. In the alternative timeline, Byzantine Constantinople hosted printing in Greek, Latin, and Arabic simultaneously. The city's multilingual, multi-religious character meant no single religious authority could monopolize or ban the technology. Printed books in Arabic script were as common as Latin script books. Islamic scholars used printing to distribute theological, scientific, and literary works across the Middle East and North Africa. The Islamic printing revolution enabled knowledge distribution that never occurred in our timeline's Ottoman-dominated Islamic world. The consequences were profound. Literacy rates in Islamic societies were comparable to Christian Europe, perhaps 15 to 20% in urban areas versus 5 to 8% in our timeline's Ottoman Empire. Islamic scientific development, instead of stagnating, experienced a modest revival. Mathematical, astronomical, and medical texts circulated widely. But this created unexpected tensions. Higher literacy meant more religious debate, more theological controversy, more fragmentation of Islamic religious authority. The unified Islamic world that the Ottoman Empire would have provided in our timeline never emerged. Instead, Islamic civilization became intellectually vibrant but politically fractured.
Industry. The implications extended into the timing and nature of industrialization itself. In our timeline, the Industrial Revolution began in Britain and spread rapidly through Europe and North America. Historians debate its causes, but military competition, including the long rivalry with Ottoman power, created incentives for technological innovation and capital accumulation. In the alternative timeline, without centuries of Ottoman military pressure driving European innovation, industrialization came later and more gradually. The breakthrough still occurred in Britain years later than on our timeline. Steam engines were developed, but more slowly. Mechanized textile production emerged, but with less urgency. Coal mining and iron production advanced, but without the military-industrial pressures that characterized our timeline. Alternative timeline's industrial development was roughly equivalent to our 1800, a 50-year lag that persisted through the 19th century. But the slower industrialization had silver linings. The catastrophic social disruptions of our timeline's industrial revolution, child labor, urban squalor, mass exploitation, were less severe because they happened more gradually over a longer period. Labor movements had more time to organize. Social reforms came earlier in the industrial process rather than as reactions to already entrenched exploitation. By 1900, the alternative timeline had achieved industrial development comparable to our timeline's 1880s, but with better labor conditions, less environmental damage, and more equitable wealth distribution.
Resistance. Most significantly, the slower pace of European technological advancement enabled greater resistance to colonization. In our timeline, the technological gap between Europe and the rest of the world was so vast that indigenous resistance was futile. European machine guns defeated African and Asian armies with ease. European industrial capacity enabled extraction of resources at scale. European administrative systems imposed order on colonized societies. In the alternative timeline, the technological gap was smaller. Indigenous and Asian states had more time to adapt and adopt European technologies. The printing revolution and Arabic script meant Middle Eastern and North African societies weren't as far behind. European colonization had occurred but looked different. Many African and Asian states became semi-colonial, economically dominated by Europe but retaining political autonomy. The catastrophic Berlin Conference, which divided Africa among European powers in our timeline, never happened in the alternative timeline because African states were strong enough to resist complete colonization. Only about 35% of Africa was under direct European control, compared to nearly 90% in our timeline.
Asian states like China, Japan, and Persia maintained more independence. The indigenous peoples of the Americas had been devastated by disease, that was unavoidable, but retained more political power and cultural integrity. The 20th century was shaping up to be far more multipolar than our timeline's European-dominated global order.
Act 4. The Great Divergence. The most profound implications emerge when we consider what economic historians call the Great Divergence, the moment when Western Europe pulled dramatically ahead of the rest of the world in wealth, technology, and power. In our timeline, the Great Divergence occurred between 1500 and 1800. Western Europe had achieved economic output per capita roughly 3 to 4 times higher than China, India, or the Islamic world. This gap enabled colonization, shaped global power dynamics, and created the modern world order. In the alternative timeline, the Great Divergence either never occurred or was dramatically less pronounced. Without Ottoman military pressure driving European innovation, without the religious civilizational conflict motivating colonial expansion, without the urgency that shaped our timeline's European development, Europe advanced more slowly. In the alternative timeline, European economic output per capita was only about 1.5 to 2 times higher than Asia and the Middle East, a significant advantage but not overwhelming dominance. The world in the alternative timeline was multipolar. European states were powerful but not hegemonic. The Byzantine Empire, though aged, still existed as a significant Mediterranean power. Islamic civilization, while politically fragmented, maintained economic vitality. China and India retained more autonomy and economic strength. But this raises the most disturbing question. Was European dominance in our timeline, for all its injustices and violence, actually more stable than the multipolar alternative timeline?
Never-ending wars. Because here's what the alternative timeline reveals. Multipolarity created constant conflict. In our timeline, European hegemony created a relatively stable world order. Colonial exploitation was terrible, but it was organized exploitation. The period was called the Long Peace because major European powers rarely fought each other directly. In the alternative timeline, with no clear global hegemony, great power conflicts were constant. The Byzantine Empire, European powers, fragmented Islamic states, and resurgent Asian powers competed endlessly for trade routes, territories, and influence. In the alternative timeline, there were 14 major wars involving multiple great powers, compared to only few on our timeline during the same period. Total war deaths were actually higher in the alternative timeline, despite less technological capacity for destruction. The 20th century in the alternative timeline looked even more chaotic. Without European hegemony creating enforced stability, without the Ottoman Empire having unified the Islamic world, without clear dominant powers, the world entered an era of multipolar competition that made our timeline's world wars look almost restrained by comparison. The alternative timeline's Great War began and lasted 12 years of grinding conflict that killed an estimated 45 million people, compared to World War I's 20 million deaths.
The Atomic Age. And then came the most terrifying discovery. The alternative timeline reached atomic weapons without the Cold War's stabilizing bipolar deterrence. Nuclear fission was achieved in 1947 in the alternative timeline, 2 years after our timeline's atomic bombs. But instead of 2 superpowers achieving nuclear weapons and creating mutual deterrence, 6 powers developed atomic bombs between 1947 and 1955. Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Japan, and Byzantium. Yes, the Byzantine Empire survived into the Atomic Age in this timeline. Without the bipolar stability of our timeline's Cold War, nuclear weapons proliferated rapidly. 14 nations possessed atomic bombs. By 1970, it was already 27 nations, including several relatively unstable states that would never have achieved nuclear weapons in our timeline's non-proliferation regime. The Cuban Missile Crisis equivalent in this timeline occurred, but between the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic Federation, a confederation of Middle Eastern states formed in 1955. It resolved peacefully, but barely. There were 7 near-miss nuclear incidents in the alternative timeline, compared to the well-documented ones in our timeline during the Cold War. The alternative timeline reached the year 2000, but the risk of nuclear war remained perpetually high. The multipolar world, for all its benefits in preventing hegemonic exploitation, created persistent instability that our timeline's imperfect but real superpower management partly avoided.
Conclusion. We began this journey asking, what if the Ottoman Empire failed at Constantinople? What if Islamic expansion was curtailed and the Ottoman state fragmented instead of flourishing? We've seen a world where Christianity and Islam developed along different trajectories, where the Byzantine Empire survived into the modern era, serving as a bridge between civilizations, where the Islamic world remained politically fragmented but intellectually vibrant, where European colonization was less total but also less ideologically motivated, where industrialization came slower but gentler, where the world remained multipolar but less stable. It's a world many might prefer in some ways: less European hegemony, more cultural survival among colonized peoples, better labor conditions during industrialization, a more balanced global power structure. But we've also discovered something troubling, that the Ottoman Empire's success in our timeline, while enabling Islamic expansion and creating centuries of conflict, also provided unifying structure that prevented worse fragmentation. That European dominance, for all its injustices, created a degree of stability that multipolar competition never achieved. That the world order we know, however flawed, emerged partly because one siege succeeded when it should have failed. Perhaps both timelines reveal uncomfortable truths, that civilizational conflict drives innovation but creates terrible suffering, that hegemony enables stability but perpetuates injustice, that historical outcomes we consider catastrophic might have prevented even worse alternatives. The walls of Constantinople stand unbreached in alternative May of 1453. Emperor Constantine watches the Ottoman army retreat, having saved his city and empire against impossible odds. In one timeline, ours, those walls fell, and 5 centuries of Ottoman power reshaped the world. In the alternative timeline, they held, and the world found a different, equally complex path forward. Which world was better? Which Constantine would you want to be? The history contains infinite sieges. The walls that held or fell shape everything that follows. The empires that succeeded or failed echo through centuries. But in every timeline, one truth remains, that the great pivotal moments of history, a single unlocked gate, a commander's wound, a sultan's ambition, carry consequences far beyond anything the participants could imagine. And perhaps the real lesson isn't which empire should have won or lost, but understanding that every historical outcome, however seemingly inevitable in retrospect, hung by the thinnest of threads. Remember to leave a like and subscribe for more similar stories.